The execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger wasn't your typical medieval punishment. It wasn't just a public display meant to deter rebellion. It was a brutal erasure, a slow, methodical destruction of his body, identity, and legacy. It was crafted to send a single, terrifying message. This is what happens when someone dares not only to defy the crown, but worse, when someone tries to control it. He was never king. But during the final years of Edward II's rule, Hugh Despenser might as well have been. He wasn't just close to power, he was the power behind the throne. Some called him a traitor, others accused him of sodomy, corruption, tyranny, but those were just the surface-level charges. The truth? Hugh wasn't executed because he broke the law. He was executed because he became the law. And when he finally fell, there was no real trial, just a spectacle. He was dragged in chains through towns filled with angry crowds, bound in the same cold iron he once used to imprison his enemies. What came next wasn't justice. It was revenge. Personal, political, almost theatrical. Contemporary witnesses wrote down every gruesome detail like they were recording surgery. Castration, disembowelment, limbs severed one by one, all while he was still alive. It wasn't about death, it was about erasure. Because the people in charge didn't just want him gone, they wanted his memory gone too. But how did it get this far? What kind of man ends up at the center of such overwhelming hatred? And why did an entire kingdom cheer as his organs were fed to the flames? To answer that, we need to go back. Back to a crumbling court, a fragile king, a queen pushed to the edge, and a man who climbed too high. To the outside world, Hugh Despenser the Younger looked like any other high-ranking noble. He came from good stock, married into royalty, had wealth and connections. But underneath all that polish was someone far more dangerous, sharp, ruthless, and absolutely hungry for power. He was born into a world where influence meant survival, and betrayal? That wasn't evil. It was a strategy. By the early 1320s, England was falling apart. King Edward II had proven himself weak and indecisive. The nobles didn't respect him. His court was chaotic, and his trust in favorites, first Piers Gaveston, then Despenser, only made things worse. But Despenser wasn't satisfied with being the king's advisor. He wanted to rule. And Edward, desperate for loyalty, gave him everything: land, titles, wealth, legal immunity. Despenser took it all. Not through war, but through manipulation so subtle it would make a modern spin doctor jealous. He had enemies exiled. He seized estates and rewrote inheritances. He twisted the justice system to serve his own ends. Slowly, he turned the English court into a personal empire, with the king as little more than his puppet. But absolute power creates absolute enemies. The barons hated him. The commoners feared him. Even Queen Isabella, Edward's French wife, found herself shut out of court life. Her dignity stripped, her household dismantled, her children used as pawns. And at the center of it all was Hugh Despenser. He didn't just influence Edward, he possessed him. He read his letters, wrote his speeches, intercepted foreign messages. Edward became the face. Despenser was the voice. Those who spoke against him vanished. Some were locked away, others were executed. The message was clear: challenge the crown, and by extension, Despenser, and you were signing your own death warrant. But Despenser wasn't just hungry for control. He wanted to be remembered. He paid chroniclers to praise him, forced monks to say daily prayers in his name. This wasn't politics. It was an unofficial coronation. A shadow king wearing no crown, but holding all the power. And there's one rule in history that never changes. When someone starts to believe they're invincible, they're already on the edge of falling. While Despenser basked in royal favor, the world outside was crumbling. Queen Isabella, humiliated and politically exiled, was sharpening her knives. A rebellion was forming, noble-led, well-funded, and patient. They didn't want Edward, not yet. They wanted Despenser. In 1325, Isabella was sent to France on a peace mission, but she never came back. Instead, she raised an army. Her ally? Roger Mortimer, a former noble turned political prisoner who had escaped Edward and Despenser's grip. Together they gathered nobles, mercenaries, and foreign allies. They weren't just aiming to reclaim power. They were planning to take it apart. By 1326, they landed in England. They didn't need to fight for cities. Loyalty crumbled on its own. Town by town, lord by lord, England surrendered, not to violence, but to the memory of Despenser's cruelty. Edward and Hugh ran, not like rulers, but like criminals. No army stood with them. No noble raised their banner. Even their friends melted away. They were fugitives now, haunted by the very kingdom they used to rule. When Despenser was finally captured, he wasn't wearing armor. He wasn't found leading troops into battle. He was filthy, starving, hiding in a Welsh abbey in monk's robes. A man who once wielded power like a sword was now begging for sanctuary. And none came. Royal troops dragged him out, chained him like livestock, tossed him into a prison cart. Gone were his silks and titles, replaced with rags, rust, and the stench of fear. But his death didn't begin with a blade. It began with humiliation. He was paraded through town after town, not as a noble captive, but as a fallen tyrant. Crowds gathered not just to mock the man, but to witness the collapse of an entire era. His beard was shaved, his clothes were torn, he was strapped backwards to a horse, his face turned to the tail, a final insult that turned a feared figure into a public joke. Some accounts say he cried, that the chains cut deep, that he vomited when told what would happen to him. This wasn't execution. It was slow psychological torture. Eventually, he was brought to Hereford, where Queen Isabella had set up court. She didn't meet him in a throne room. She stood outside, surrounded by the nobles who had lost sons, land, and power to Despenser's schemes. Her face showed no pleasure, only cold intent. There was no trial, just a statement. Treason, theft, war crimes, sodomy, witchcraft. No proof was needed. The verdict had already been decided. Then came the scaffold, and with it, the end of Hugh Despenser the Younger. By 1325, England wasn't just politically unstable, it was spiritually decaying. The people were hungry, their fields stripped bare to feed a court that no longer represented them. The king had retreated into a world of denial, propped up by the cold machinery of Hugh Despenser's growing grip on power. Parliament, once meant to advise the king, had been reduced to a ceremonial chorus, its voice ignored, its relevance fading. And in the center of that storm was Despenser. He had become more than a tyrant. He was the symbol of everything wrong with the realm. Every unjust tax, every land seizure, every act of cruelty handed down by the crown. His name was whispered behind it all. His list of enemies wasn't just long, it was prestigious. Nearly half the English nobility, men with armies and ambitions of their own, counted Despenser as their personal nemesis, but it was his treatment of Queen Isabella that sealed his fate. Isabella, once the obedient wife of King Edward II, had endured over a decade of cold dismissal. Her position at court was gutted, her household disbanded, her children used as pawns in Dispenser's power games. Publicly humiliated and politically muzzled, she was a queen in name only, trapped in a court ruled by a man who held no crown but wielded all the power. What Dispenser failed to see, or perhaps refused to believe, was that Isabella was not broken. In 1325, she was sent to France on a diplomatic mission to smooth tensions between England and her homeland. But once she crossed the Channel, Isabella never came back. She didn't return to court. She didn't send apologies. She didn't plead for her place back. She went to war. While in exile, Isabella aligned herself with Roger Mortimer, a powerful nobleman with a personal vendetta against Dispenser. Mortimer had once been imprisoned by the very regime he now sought to destroy. Together, he and Isabella forged a rebellion, not from peasants with pitchforks, but with barons, mercenaries, and foreign money. It was a coup engineered not in darkness, but in daylight. They didn't storm castles. They didn't need to. They moved across England like a tide, town by town, noble by noble, winning over hearts not with bloodshed, but with silence. Loyalty to Edward collapsed almost overnight. The fear Dispenser had once inspired vanished like mist. Even the king's most faithful servants looked the other way, unwilling to defend a regime that had lost all legitimacy. By the time Dispenser and Edward tried to flee, they weren't monarchs, they were fugitives. Once men bowed to them. Now they bolted doors and whispered behind shutters. No one came to their defense. No one risked their name for theirs. And when Dispenser was finally captured, it wasn't on a battlefield. It was in disguise, hiding in a Welsh monastery, dressed as a monk. Not a general in defeat, but a criminal in hiding, caked in mud, trembling with fear. His arrest sparked celebration. In London, bonfires lit up the sky. Crowds danced in the streets. After years of oppression, England exhaled. It wasn't just justice they wanted, it was vengeance. But what followed wasn't a trial. It was a reckoning. Queen Isabella and Mortimer didn't want due process. They wanted a message, a statement, something so unforgettable it would echo through generations. And so began the unmaking of Hugh Dispenser. When he was dragged from that abbey, it wasn't with dignity. He was chained like cattle, paraded through villages where mothers spat in the dust as he passed. Children jeered, old men threw stones. This wasn't punishment, it was a ritual, a public purification of the sins that had poisoned the land. At every stop, the ritual deepened. His beard was shaved in public, emasculating him. His fine robes were torn and replaced with rags that clung to his emaciated frame. He was strapped to a horse, but backward, facing the tail, forced to stare at the road he had already lost. Chroniclers say he wept openly, that the chains cut into his flesh, that he begged to confess, not to clear his name, but out of sheer terror of what awaited him. He was brought to Hereford, where Queen Isabella had set up her temporary court. But she wasn't waiting behind closed doors. She stood outside, surrounded by nobles, many of whom had lost everything to Dispenser's greed. They wanted blood, and they got it. There was no courtroom, no jury, just a pre-written sentence, read aloud like lines in a play. Treason, sodomy, theft, war crimes, consorting with devils. Each charge less about fact and more about theater. No evidence needed. The verdict had been decided long before the man had been captured. Dispenser was dragged by horses to the scaffold. But this wasn't some standard gallows. It was enormous, raised high, built wide, constructed not just for killing, but for spectacle. The crowd had come from all across the region. They weren't there to see a death. They came to watch a story end. He tried to speak, to beg, to pray, but no one heard him. Trumpets blared, drums pounded, the noise drowned out his words. And then it began. Not with a sword, not with mercy, with fire. They hung him, but only until he choked. Not long enough to kill, just enough to taste death. Then they cut him down, still alive, gasping. Then came the knives. First, the castration, an unmistakable sign of political emasculation. His genitals were cut off and tossed into a fire as the crowd howled. Some cheered, others vomited, but no one turned away. Then came the disembowelment. The executioner worked slowly, carefully. The goal wasn't speed, it was endurance. Hugh Dispenser's abdomen was slit open. His intestines, still warm and pulsing, were dragged out inch by inch. The fire beside the scaffold wasn't just for effect. It was where his body was fed, one part at a time, while he was still alive to watch. Chroniclers said his body writhed uncontrollably, that he screamed, that at one moment his eyes met Isabella's, not in plea but in disbelief. This wasn't execution. It was medieval propaganda etched into flesh. The finale was the heart, split open with a hatchet. The ribs cracked apart slowly. When the heart was removed, some said Dispenser was still faintly conscious. Just enough for pain, just enough to know. They burned that too. Only then, when nothing remained of the man but a pile of trembling meat, did they let him die. But death wasn't the end, because the sentence wasn't complete. The next phase, dismemberment. They didn't chop the limbs, they sawed them off, one at a time. The bones cracked, the crowd grew quiet. Then each piece, arms, legs, hands, feet, was wrapped and shipped across the kingdom. A tour of terror. His head? It was impaled on a spike above London Bridge, England's beating heart. He wasn't buried. He wasn't mourned. He was erased. The execution of Hugh Dispenser wasn't just a punishment. It was a transformation. A man once considered untouchable had been turned into a grotesque warning, a cautionary tale carved into national memory, bone by bone. And yet, history isn't just shaped by the powerful, it's haunted by them. In the silence that followed his death, England didn't find peace. The rebellion had succeeded, yes. Edward II was forced to abdicate, and his son, young Edward III, was placed on the throne. But the realm wasn't healed. It had merely traded one shadow for another. Roger Mortimer, now Isabella's lover and co-ruler, quickly filled the vacuum Hugh Dispenser left behind. And like Dispenser before him, Mortimer became greedy, suspicious, ruthless. He too ruled through fear. He too silenced dissent. He too forgot the lesson Dispenser's broken body had tried to teach. Because power in medieval England was never held, it was borrowed. And sooner or later, the lenders came calling. Just 3 years after Dispenser's death, Mortimer met the same fate. Arrested by Edward III, now a young man grown impatient with his mother's regency, Mortimer was dragged through the Tower of London. He was charged with treason, not just for the crimes he committed, but for the company he had kept. The message was clear. What begins in fire ends in fire. Mortimer was hanged in 1330, not disemboweled, not butchered, but his fall was no less complete. And Queen Isabella? She was spared, out of respect, or perhaps strategy. She lived out her days in comfortable exile, a queen without a crown, a mother to a king, a woman who had torn apart a nation to reclaim her dignity and lost her place in the process. So what does this story really tell us? It tells us that history is not a clean arc. It doesn't reward justice, and it rarely punishes evil in tidy ways. It tells us that sometimes monsters are made in the mirror of survival. That tyranny wears many faces, some cruel, some charming. Some even look like queens. And it reminds us that punishment, no matter how spectacular, never rewrites the past. The mutilation of Hugh Dispenser did not undo his crimes. It did not return stolen lands. It did not unstarve peasants. It didn't restore honor to the nobles he humiliated or bring back the lives his policies had shattered. What it did was show the crowd that someone could pay. That pain could be answered with more pain. That if the heavens were silent, men could make their own justice, brutal, raw, and permanent. But in that spectacle, something else was lost. A piece of the nation's soul. Because when violence becomes performance, when executions become theater, what dies isn't just the man at the scaffold. What dies is mercy, moderation, civilization. In the end, Dispenser's legacy wasn't his cruelty. It was the cruelty he inspired in others. And that, perhaps, is the darkest chapter of all.